we were very glad when USAID and the STAIR project in particular approached the chamber and said they'd like to do an awareness session for our members on public-private partnerships. PPPs have been something that the Ceylon Chamber has been advocating for some time, whether it was in budget submissions or in other advocacy forums. It's something we've been doing for a while. The more recent initiative was when the National Agenda Committee on Infrastructure, which is one of 5 specialized thematic committees. There are some members of that committee who are here today. Praveer Samarasinghe is the co-chair of that. They took up this agenda as a priority area for the chamber to focus on. And over the last few months, it's something we've engaged with, whether it was USAID, IFC, with the World Bank, and others, on putting forward a private sector position on PPPs, advocating for doing more projects with PPPs, getting more private sector participation in infrastructure projects and so on. So this workshop today that USAID is delivering is a nice, it links in nicely to on previous and ongoing initiatives of the Ceylon Chamber. We're very happy to have David Baxter with us. I'm not going to go further into introducing him. I'm sure there'll be someone who takes over as MC from here. But just once again, thank you to all our members who are here today, and I hope this is a productive session. And the Ceylon Chamber stands ready to work with anyone who is interested in PPPs so we can make the right connections through institutions like USAID and others. And we're very glad that Thilan Vijayasinghe, who is the new chairman of the National PPP Agency, will also be joining us. So really take this opportunity to hear from folks like him, and particularly from David Baxter and the folks at USAID, who are a valuable knowledge resource on this. And I wish you well in your, to our members in all your PPP endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This workshop is organized by the USAID Short-Term Assistance to Improve Public Financial Management Reform STAIR project in collaboration with the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. To conduct the welcome address, I would like to invite Mr. Praveer Samarasinghe, the co-chair of the National Agenda Committee on Infrastructure of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce.
Good afternoon. Welcome to today's expert workshop that we have had the opportunity to facilitate through the resources of the USAID, and I thank the USAID for that as well. As mentioned by Anusha, the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce has a few agenda committees where we took up certain priority areas in the economy in Sri Lanka, and one was infrastructure development. And in that committee of ours, the first project that we undertook was to promote the concept of PPPs. As we all know, the need for continued accelerated infrastructure development is essential for this country and our economy for our development needs. And engaging the private sector in that development process through the model of PPP will greatly benefit not only spurring investment, but also to make sure there is no too much of a burden on the government finances. So with that, our committee submitted or prepared. We have a committee which has a lot of stakeholders from the private sector, state sector, and certain donor agencies as well. And we prepared a policy paper on the establishment of PPPs. And the main recommendation of that was to establish this dedicated unit for PPP, and we are thankful that subsequently it was established, and one of our own committee members, Thilan Vijayasinghe, was eventually appointed chairman of that committee as well. Thereafter, we took up the matter, just to keep you appraised, on fast-tracking the implementation of the PPP unit. And there again, we met up with relevant policymakers, whether it's for the President's office or Prime Minister's office, or with the Finance Ministry, megapolis ministries as well, to fast-track the PPP unit. And in that, we addressed a number of recommendations. And we also brought up, I was just mentioning it to him, creating certain guidelines on the responsibilities between this PPP unit as well as the line ministries, because we have to work in a practical environment and where the different responsibilities exist between these two divisions as well. And of course, we are happy USAID is involved in the capacity building exercise, which was one of the other areas that we took up as very important, and including the establishment of the pipeline of the relevant projects which will conform under such an environment. So with that short introduction, I would like to thank the USAID again and for bringing the expert resources to Sri Lanka to facilitate the establishment and implementation of the PPP unit. And with that short remarks, you will have to excuse me, I'll be leaving the meeting, but I'll leave it to you all to continue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Samarasinghe. This workshop is organized by the USAID Short-Term Assistance to Improve Public Financial Management Reform, STAIR project. Today we have the Acting Mission Director of the USAID Sri Lanka, Ms. Elizabeth Dabneaston. Madam, I would like you to invite to conduct the opening remarks.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to join everyone here today on this important topic that shows such a good point of engagement between the private sector and the public sector, just in what we are doing today and what we can push forward with public-private partnership. I know we have many important things to discuss today, so I'll try to keep my remarks very brief. As you can see across the globe, there is an important trend in economic and social development that is taking place in many countries where the private sector is increasingly taking on what had previously been considered government functions. Governments around the world are now developing significant partnerships with both domestic and global private sector companies and organizations to deliver vital public services and address many different needs, including infrastructure, environmental protection, small and medium enterprise development, education, technology, and youth employment. This public-private partnership model combines the assets and experiences of strategic partners by leveraging capital and investment, creativity and expertise, technology, access to markets, all of which used together to solve complex problems faced by governments, businesses, and communities across the world. In developed and developing countries alike, this model has contributed to long-term economic and social growth, supported innovation, and increased sustainability. A well-executed PPP can be a simple and powerful tool for procuring and managing public infrastructure efficiently, and the model has significant potential to have large impact in the developing world. It is at a very opportune moment that the government of Sri Lanka has launched a strategy to finance and manage much-needed infrastructure and public service delivery projects through PPPs. USAID has helped many countries around the world to implement this model, and we are pleased to be able to assist the government of Sri Lanka at their request in bringing together public and private sector into mutually beneficial partnerships to help steer the country towards greater economic prosperity. USAID, through our STAIR project, has provided a variety of assistance to the government of Sri Lanka, including public financial management, good governance reform issues, including public procurement systems, fiscal analysis capabilities, and internal and external audits. In September last year, this project partnered with the Department of Public Finance at the Ministry of Finance to conduct a high-level national conference on public-private partnership. The conference engaged government officials across many different agencies and departments and raised awareness of PPPs while identifying short, medium, and long-term actions. As a follow-up to that national conference, fora such as this one are providing occasions for stakeholders to learn how to take full advantage of the opportunities created by public-private partnerships. PPPs required dedicated attention, thoughtful monitoring, and a capacity to make and execute informed procurement decisions. For more than 60 years, the U.S. government has been proud to provide development and humanitarian assistance to improve the lives and futures of Sri Lankans. We have supported projects in diverse fields, including agriculture, environment and natural resource management, health, education, business and trade, good governance, and humanitarian assistance. It is our hope that this opportunity will be one more opportunity for you to maximize in order to create a stronger PPP enabling environment, which will encourage greater private sector involvement in PPPs. I wish you a very productive and fruitful discussion. Thank you for inviting me to participate today.
Thank you, Ms. Elizabeth, the Acting Mission Director of the USAID. The ensuring regulatory and monitoring aspects of public finance management is done by Department of Public Finance. The Director General, Mr. P. Algama, is not here with us today. He's abroad. But however, we have a video clip recorded earlier for this particular event. So I would like to play that now.
It is my pleasure to welcome you all for this session. I should be thankful to USAID for organizing this session with Chambers of Commerce and inviting me to address this audience. With the new government came into power in January 2015, the concept of good governance has become more prominent than before because bad governance has been singled out as a main cause for number of economic issues in the country. In recently concluded DPL mission, the World Bank, ADB, USAID and JICA have agreed to help Sri Lanka in number of public financial management reform. Public financial management bill is the most significant among these reforms. This will replace 1992 version of financial regulation which governs the public sector transaction. We, the Department of Public Finance of the Ministry of Finance, working currently with the USAID STAR project, drafting a new set of guidelines on public-private partnership which will replace part 2 of the Government Procurement Guideline, Private Sector Infrastructure Project Guidelines of 1998. This would provide better regulatory framework for the new investment through PPP arrangements. Due to budget constraints we are facing and shrinking public debt capacity, public-private partnership has been emerged as an alternative solution and urgent need to accelerate economic development of this country. The new public-private partnership mechanism to be introduced will no doubt help the government attract foreign investors, especially in economic infrastructure development sector, easing the government budget constraint. Sri Lanka, under the theme of electronic government procurement, recently concluded 4th South Asian Region Procurement Conference here in Colombo. This conference was held at the right time, as the development partners have indicated their support to introduce an electronic government procurement for the public sector Sri Lanka. That will be a major step forward as it provides a platform for more transparent public service delivery. Moreover, we have concluded number of capacity building programs with the World Bank, USAID and ADB support on public-private partnership and public procurement. With these reforms initiative, I am hopeful that Sri Lanka economic landscape will be changed soon. Thank you.
The supporting and facilitating of public-private partnerships is done by the Public-Private Partnership Agency of Sri Lanka. We have invited Mr. Thilan Vijayasinghe, the chairman of PPP agency.
Again, thank you very much, USAID and Nathan Associates for organizing today's event. I will only speak for a couple of minutes, allowing this to be more of an interactive session. I'm less than a month in my current position of, I still have to refer to my title, at the National Agency for Public-Private Partnership. Very simply, PPPs are complicated by definition. They require a fair amount of creativity, financial engineering, legal structuring, a lot of stakeholder engagement. And PPPs by definition require the right type of people and the right type of policies. So the positive news is that the policies are in place. This government recognized the importance of PPPs going back right to the inception of this administration. And therefore, on the policy front, we really do not have any issues. It is really the PPP process and the staffing of the PPP with the right PPP agency with the right sort of staff is really the challenge. Because at the moment, there is too much, there are many PPPs in the works in various line ministries operating under 2 or 3 existing government procurement procedures, and there is an overall lack of consistency as a consequence. So my primary task has been the last 3 weeks, 2 or 3 things. One is to have the PPP agency manned with a very competent and capable board. And I'm happy that the Honorable Minister of Finance has approved an extremely good board involving Treasury officials, practitioners, bringing in disciplines such as taxation onto my board, and I don't want to preempt the decision. The appointment letters will be going very soon. It's a very powerful board who will guide me and create the policy environment and eventually rubber stamp the PPP guidelines. Next task is to ensure that the agency is staffed with the right people who are able to manage transactions from diverse sectors of the economy, ranging from the traditional, the highways and the transport sector, even going into areas such as health and ICT. The pipeline is rather large, but they're primarily at ground floor level in terms of closing a transaction. And what I find is that virtually all government agencies, while they think it's a great deal to have RFQ out or an RFP out, are quite oblivious to the complexities of the financial negotiation and the legal structuring and actual closing a transaction. So my next task is I've appealed to the donor agencies to provide me with the right sort of funding to have the right sort of people paying the right sort of market rates. That has been a challenge, obviously, as you know, using treasury funding, it's rather challenging to pay market rates, but I'm happy that several agencies, World Bank, apart from USAID, Millennium Challenge Corporation and ADB have stepped in to assist us at very short notice. So hopefully within the next month or 2, I'll have a very capable and competent management team. Even though my predecessor had a management team recruited, they're all qualified. I'm not in any way disparaging the people who have already been recruited. They're fine in terms of assisting in PPP transactions, but really there's no one in the agency that has had investment banking, development banking, legal structuring of complex transactions. None of those experience, none of that experience is there within the agency. One final comment is that something that I've learned and which is of great optimism for me and for all of you is that, as you're aware, there's a significant amount of viability issues governing PPPs because of affordability factors, for example, toll roads. However, I'm encouraged by virtue of the World Bank, Millennium Challenge Corporation, World Economic Forum has created a new organization that would channel viability gap funding in our direction. The World Bank, I'm told, has about 200 million US. Millennium Challenge Corporation would disburse grant funding from about end of 2018 onwards, several $100 million targeting the land sector and the transport sector. And then the World Economic Forum, they're looking for sustainable development goal type projects such as solar energy for viability gap funding of projects in excess of ideally over 100 million US. So if you total all this up, there is close to $1 billion US of potential viability gap funding to supplement the traditional sources of financing that you in the private sector have available for PPP projects. So the challenge is to create the project pipeline, because without the correct documentation, the correct type of projects being identified, interfacing with the line ministries, and we need to do this yesterday. If we do not have a credible pipeline with a credible process, then we will be unable to take advantage of these attractive concessionary sources of funding that will go right into the SPV that is undertaking the investment.
I would like to invite Mr. Thomas Burola the Chief of Party of USAID Short-Term Assistance to Improve Public Financial Management Reform, the STARE project, to address the gathering.
To move on, I would also like to mention that by popular demand, we have had requests that we open up a little bit of question and answers. So I'd like to put that to Mr. Baxter, who's next. He'll be giving a presentation. We do believe that this presentation is built for the private sector, and we would encourage, we'd like to say, I don't want to use the word limited, but certainly because of the time frame, if you do have questions, David will open up to question and answers on some of the ideas for international best practice. And when Mr. Talan arrives, again, we'll give him an opportunity, of course, to talk about the new NAPPP. Okay, David?
Okay. Well, thank you very much to everyone for allowing me to be here today. This is my first time that I am in Sri Lanka, so it's a very interesting experience for me. I think what I find fascinating is that I come from South Africa originally. I come from the city of Cape Town, and I don't know if any of you have been there, but it has a very, very interesting and similar history to sort of a colonial history to what happened in Colombo. It was discovered by the Portuguese, the same as the Portuguese came and traded here. It was settled by the Dutch, and they settled here in Colombo. It was then occupied by the British. You were occupied by the British as well. So many of your traditions, your architecture, your food, and your culture are very, very similar. And somehow I feel like I'm at home. There's a lot of things that just make sense to me. I was terribly excited to see that you had samosas. So I had some of those. I've had more than I should have had them for lunch, breakfast, and dinner. But they're really good. But one thing that I want to tell you is a very interesting experience before I start my presentation about what happened to me when I arrived here on Sunday morning. I arrived at the airport and I got on, there was a taxi driver waiting to pick me up, and we started driving on the wonderful new highway that you have from the airport to the city. And I said to him, wow, this is a great road. And then I noticed that there were a number of toll gates on the road. And I said to him, this is a toll road. And he really astounded me, and he said, yes, this is a toll road, and it was built as a PPP. Now, I don't know, there's not many times that you go to different parts of the world where you come across a taxi driver that can tell you that the big infrastructure system or facility that you're using was a public-private partnership. And I thought, well, this is fascinating. I was going to continue the conversation. So I said to him, well, what do you think about the road? And he said, this road we like. And I said, well, why do you like it? He said, because it's convenient, it's useful, and it's helped improve the traffic situation. And he says this is a good PPP project because it has the ability to pay for itself. And I thought, wow, this gentleman, I don't know what he is in his real life, but he knows about PPPs, he knows about toll roads, he knows about infrastructure built with a purpose, and he also knows about the fact that it can afford to pay for himself. I said, well, how do you know so much? He says, well, there's a lot of PPPs that are happening and have happened in Sri Lanka. And I said, well, what do you feel about them in general? And he said, well, most of them are good. I said, okay, well, that's good. And he said, some of them haven't been so good, and we as Sinhalese are very concerned about them. And I said, well, can you explain or tell me which ones you're concerned about? He said, well, there's a port, and there's an airport that have been built, which no one's using or are underutilized, and we're very concerned about that. And this has again really left me astounded, because this has contributed to the national debt, and we don't know how we're going to pay it off. So really what he did, without realizing it, is he gave me a very, very good sort of little mini lecture on the pros and cons of PPPs from his perspective. And I asked him, where did you get this information? How do you know this stuff? He says, I read the newspapers. And so that was fascinating for me to hear that the national press in Sri Lanka is actually following what's happening on the PPP agenda, the PPP market. And that's a good thing, because it means that people are educated in this country about PPPs, they have an understanding about it, and it also helps the government to understand that the citizenry are watching and seeing what's happening, and it also helps the government because when they start talking to different partners and stakeholders, that they are going to have an audience that maybe understands a little bit about PPPs. I just want to ask, just for a show of hands, how many of you have been involved in a PPP? Okay, so there's maybe a few, and I gather because of your attendance here, you are terribly interested in what's going to happen with the national PPP agenda and where it's going to. I'm going to give you a presentation. I'm going to just talk very briefly about what PPPs are, and then I'm going to start talking about a presentation that is based on a blog that I wrote for the World Bank about the beginning of this year. There is so much written about how PPPs can support governments. Almost every bit of literature, if you read, it's very much focused on government programs, government agendas, how governments are going to launch PPPs. But very, very seldom is there anything that addresses how the private sector can engage with the government in PPPs. So it's always from a public sector towards the private sector instead of from the private sector towards the government. So you will see, and I'm going to go through what I call 10 questions that the private sector should ask the public sector. We're going to go over these 10 questions, and I would ask you just to take note and think about them very carefully, so that as the PPP programs evolve in this country, as people start talking more about them, as the private sector starts talking to the government more, that you have an understanding of maybe these 10 really important questions that you can ask the public sector when you go to meetings, or if there's pre-bid conferences, or if you even have consultations with them, that you can ask these questions and get a sense of, where the private sector is, where the public sector is and where they are ready or not. So one thing I was very pleased to hear, there was a discussion or a mention of building the institutional capacity of the government, which is critical, because you can have the best ideas and you can have the best sense of the practices, but if you don't have people to do it, you're not going to move forward. The other, which is absolutely critically important, and this is something that is of absolute importance to the private sector, is understanding what the pipeline is for PPP projects as you look forward, as you move forward. And the reason is that business people like you, and not just domestic business people, but people from the international global community of business people as well, are going to be looking for the promise of an opportunity, because you're going to want to prepare, you're going to have resources, you want to be prepared, you want to know what's going to happen, and you don't want to do that if there isn't any clear path forward, and if there isn't a exercise that explains what's going to happen. One of the things that's critically important for the public sector is to get into the sense of marketing itself to the private sector. I've worked in many countries, and many countries have tried this idea that we'll start a program and then the private sector will come to us. That's not always the case. The private sector will move towards something that they feel confident is going to give them business opportunities, and this is the important element. One of the things that is also important is to understand, and this is a term I heard a few years ago and I constantly use it, is that investment is not sentimental. And I don't know if you know what I mean by that, but I'll explain, is that the private sector is not going to invest in something unless they firmly believe that there's an opportunity. This counts for domestic investors as well as for international investors, because there are a lot of other opportunities that the public-private partnerships are going to compete with. What I'm going to do is just go very briefly over just some of the basic principles and descriptions of what PPPs are, And then I will, before I launch into the 10 questions, give everyone a little bit of an opportunity just to ask any questions that you might have about what that means. But let's have a look at an introduction. So we'll look at what PPPs are. We'll also look at what PPPs are not, because there are some misconceptions. Then how you can work with the public sector. That's the main body of this presentation. And then some conclusions. Now, it's very difficult to find a standard definition of PPPs. Some organizations will say there is no standard definition of a PPP. Others will say, well, there definitely is. I've taken two here, and the first one is the World Bank's definition. And the reason why I've chosen the World Bank's is because of the partnership the World Bank's going to be having with the government here, but also because it is also one of the premier PPP developers around the world. And they say that the World Bank, it says, takes a broad view, so it's a generally broad view of PPPs as and this is the first thing that you need to understand, a long-term contract between the private party and the government. Okay, so it's a partnership, but a traditional structured PPP is also a long-term contract. This is why there are always so many lawyers involved with PPPs. And I hope there are not a lot of lawyers in this room, but sometimes lawyers are very focused on the legal documents often than the practice. But it's important that when you form these partnerships, it's like a marriage, that there is a legal document that defines the partnership. I always say to people, it's really important to read the fine print. I'm a South African originally. When I married my American wife, the day after we got married, I said to her, so when are you moving to South Africa? And she burst out laughing and she said, I don't know what you're talking about, you moving to the United States. I obviously didn't read the fine print of the contract. And you want to find that you don't get into that situation when you enter into a legal partnership with the government or with the public sector, should you enter into this practice, that you haven't read the fine print. What they say also is, what are PPPs doing? Okay, and there's two things that they offer. Is they offer public assets, so this could be roads, toll roads, airports, hospitals, physical structures. Or the other are services. So that could be for running hospitals, not building the hospital, but running the hospital, or providing waste removal services, etc. But there's two elements of it that's really important to understand. Building something, or running something, or even building and running something. Those are the fundamentals there. The other is that it's important to take note is that when the private sector agrees to form this partnership with the public sector, they are taking on some of the risk. Okay, this is really important. Now, it's a very, very important step to understand who takes on what risk and how much risk each party takes on. Governments will often say, we're going to give all the risk to the private sector. And in most instances, the private sector will say, okay, we will take all the risk, but you're going to pay us for it. Okay, because they've got to cover and protect themselves against things that are going wrong. So you've got to find this fine balance between who's taking risk. So there's bearing risk, and then there's also, you are going to take over the management responsibility from something that was typically run by the government in the past. Okay, so if you look at some of the models, if it's building something, you're not just going to build it, but you're also going to operate and run it. Okay, or if you take over service, you're going to have to manage that service. And what's important for the private sector to understand is how you're going to be paid, the remuneration that you're going to receive, is going to be tied to how well you perform. And performance is a difficult thing. Because when public-private partnerships are set up, a lot of expectations are established on who is going to do what. And if it's not clear who's going to do what, there can be performance issues, and then there can be problems with the projects. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe is a very interesting organization. They have a center for what they call a PPP Center of Excellence. They have just a broader view, but it's similar to the World Bank's. They talk about PPPs as a mechanism for financing, designing, implementing, and operating public sector facilities and service. So there's almost the same element there. But this is what you will hear often, and if you haven't heard of it, that PPPs are a mechanism for financing projects. Okay, and this is also what Tulum mentioned, is that as he's building his team, he's also building a team of experts, financial experts, who can structure or, let's say, set up deals that are going to be financeable. Okay, this is important. Now, one of the things that's also critically important, which I point out often when I talk to the private sector, is that you need to build parallel, let's say a parallel organization within your company that matches some of the structures within the public sector. So you're going to, if you're going to run a PPP, or if you're going to be part of a consortium that's going to run a PPP through what they call a special purpose vehicle or a PPP company, you're going to make sure, or you need to make sure, that you have legal experts, that you have technical experts, that you have good managers on your project, because you're going to be scrutinized by the public sector on how you perform, but you need to have people in your team that understand how they need to instruct your company or your team how to perform as well. Now, when people ask what are PPPs, let's just look at it in very simple terms, and you take away the definitions. The first there, it's a mechanism for facilitating private sector participation in the delivery of infrastructure and services. You've kind of heard of that. But one of the things, and this is why governments are terribly interested in PPPs these days, is this is a way that you can mobilize private sector capital. There's a situation, obviously, in many countries that the government has ambitions on infrastructure and services that it wants to provide to its citizens, but it often doesn't have the resources to do that. And so, people say, well, why would I choose a PPP? Well, this might be as simple as, instead of building one highway, because this is all the government can afford, I can maybe build 2 highways because the private sector can help us build and finance the other. There's one thing that I want to mention, and this is a really important technical term, is that you should not confuse funding with financing. And I hear this constantly, politicians and people who talk about PPPs, they mix them up, and it causes confusion. Funding is the public sector side. The public sector funds projects, okay? Financing is what the private sector does. The private sector finances projects. So make sure that you don't interchangeably use those terms or mix them up, because that could lead to confusion when you are into a negotiation or when you're looking at the documents. It's an alternative, as they say, also to traditional procurement. It's an allocation of risk, which I've mentioned. But PPP is also characterized by their capital-intensive nature, and then the longer-term financing requirements. Anyone in the room have an idea who want to venture what the typical length of a PPP is these days? And I'm talking about a large infrastructure PPP. How many years? 30, okay. Close on, okay. It's about 25 to 30 years, okay. So when you are entering into this partnership with the public sector, you have to ask yourself, are we ready to enter into a marriage, because it is a marriage, for 30 years? People are very focused on the design part, the build part, the financing part, but the other, and that's usually maybe the first 5 years of a project. The next 25 years of the project is where people come up short. I saw a fantastic little political cartoon once, and there were a bunch of people, they were whistling, and they were drinking champagne, and there were balloons all over the room and confetti falling from the roof, and it said, "We've closed the deal." In the next slide, there was a bunch of managers who were like pulling their hair out and going crazy because they realized, yes, the deal had been closed, but the real work is only going to be starting now. Okay. I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia in the United States. People often think that we have 50 states, but actually Virginia refers itself as a commonwealth. If you call it the state of Virginia, people get quite upset. They have just entered into a 99-year PPP. Okay. Think of the challenges that are going to be faced with that long-term commitment over 99 years. And I can just mention a number of them. How many management teams are going to be involved in that project? 4 or 5, okay? Because there's no one here in this room who's going to be around for 99 years, okay? And anyway, you might want to work for 40 years or 50 years, and then you might want to retire, okay? So there's the management team. There's that commitment. Then there's the other element, and that is we are working with certain technologies now. What are the technologies going to be in 20 years, in 30 years, in 40 years that are going to change the whole project? Okay, so these are just some of the realities that people are facing, that the private sector is facing as PPPs get longer. And I just want to stress, are we in for the long run? Are we flexible? Are we working with a partner, which is the public sector, that is flexible? Do we understand these different elements? Now, there are certain things that PPPs are not. And there's one of my pet, if I can call it pet peeves or pet hates, is when people equate PPPs with privatization. Okay, think of it. PPPs are not privatization. If you take the public or you take the private out of the public-private partnership, it's not a PPP anymore. Okay. However, certain PPPs could eventually lead to something becoming privatized, but it is not a privatization process. I currently am advising the Saudi government, their Ministry of Economy and Planning, on how they can move forward with PPPs under the new National Strategic Plan that they're following. And the very first meeting I went to, they called themselves the Privatization Committee. And that was not a good thing. At least Sri Lanka has been clever enough and thought about it to call yourself or have your new committee or unit, which is called the PPP unit. It's really important. Okay, the other thing is governments have to realize that it's not free money. Okay, there's no such thing as free money. There's a perception often that PPPs are going to be less expensive, when in reality, most PPPs cost a little bit more than if the private sector did, than if the public sector did it. And the reason is why this occurs is because of the long-term financing of the debt, but the other is that there is often a sense of innovation, new ideas, new technologies, and new practices that are introduced, and it's a whole new form that often requires a lot more effort and input in, so they can cost a little bit more. The most important element that I want to point there, they are not free of public authority monitoring. So that doesn't mean that once you win the PPP contract, that for next 25 years, 30 years, 90 years, or whatever it is, that you can do what you want to. You are still going to have that partnership with the public sector, and if they're doing their job well, they are going to monitor you, and you are going to have to report back to them. Okay? But it's also important for the public sector to understand that they have to monitor these projects. A number of years ago, I was working with a team who told me about a fascinating project that they had in Central America. It was a power project, and it was a PPP. And they discovered, much to their consternation, that the PPP project contractually had ended 5 years ago, but it was still operating and no one bothered to close the project out. And the reason was that the private sector kept quiet about it because the government seemed to be terribly excited and pleased that they were getting electricity, and the public sector just had forgotten to look at the contract to determine how long it was. And there were a tremendous amount of repercussions after that, because there had to be a lot of, debt being paid back, extra money that had been paid to the private sector. And this is just an example of a public sector monitoring program that fell flat. from what I understand of the new policies that are being developed in Sri Lanka, that this will not be the case. So why do we consider PPPs? There's new technology and innovation that can be introduced, as I mentioned. The quality of the deliverables can be improved. There can be times where money can be saved. It can take the government a long time to initiate, identify, etc., and get projects off the ground. Okay. I often smile to myself when I work with governments and I hear that they've launched a national PPP program and they're going to launch their first PPP project in 6 months. Okay. Just think, and I won't make any comments other than that realize that that is impractical. There is so much work that goes into a project, so one has to have a realistic sense of the time. There's also great ability to control costs. Why? Because you as private sector members are going to be watching your profit margins, and you're going to ensure that the project is well run, because if you don't run it well, you are going to make a loss, and no private sector institution operates that way. There's the sharing of appropriate risk, which I mentioned. You can also leverage complementarities between the public and private sector. The other is that as the private sector, and this is what your proposition needs to be when you are considering working with the government, is what new knowledge, what new practices, what new innovations do we have that we can sell, because this is what you're doing as well, to the public sector to get them excited about wanting to partner with us. You need to ask yourself, what are the special innovations, the special things that make us better or more different to the other competitors in the private sector that we are going to be competing against? So you need to think it very, very carefully through. Why do we want to do PPPs? Are we ready to do PPPs? And do we have a chance to even to pursue a PPP? Anyone have a sense in dollar amounts, maybe, how much it takes to prepare a proposal for a project that's maybe $500 or $600 million? Anyone have a clue? So if you're building a very large infrastructure project, a new port, and you are going to be proposing on that document. And so this means you're going to cover the financial aspects, the technical aspects, the legal aspects, all these things that you have to put in your proposal that you're going to get back to the government. Does anyone have a sense in dollar terms how much that proposal can cost? $1,000? $10,000? $100,000? It's more likely going to be in the millions. Okay. It's going to be in the millions. Can you see where they talk about risk? Okay. And you want to make sure that those millions that you are spending, because you are going to spend it up front before you even get to play, are you willing to do it? Are you ready to spend that money because you know enough about what is going to happen? You have enough information. You are ready to pursue that. Is this making sense what I'm saying? Okay. Think of it. It's not just a happy-go-lucky free-for-all when the government starts. You have to be prepared, and you have to be willing, and you have to be committed. Now, people talk about PPPs. I'm not going to go into all these different definitions. But there, in Sri Lanka, they've talked about BOOs, BOIs, I think, and BOTs. Okay. And this was in the 1998 PPP legislation that existed. The world has moved on since then. Okay, we are now nearly 20 years later. Okay, or maybe 30 years 20 years later. Okay. Over time, people have started developing different types of models because every project has a different type of model that works for it. The general type of project description that you might have heard is what they say DBFOM, okay, or DBFMO, okay. That's design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, okay? Or you can say maintain and operate, depending. But there are a lot of different ones. So you do need to start getting a sense of the project and what model fits it. And I'm not going to go into these in great details because you have the descriptions. But if somebody starts talking about a BOR or a BOT or a BTO or a DBFM or a DBFMO, or they talk about DBFOT, et cetera, you need to understand what that is, because that is going to determine how you structure your team and how you're going to approach it. I've just put in a very simple table here. This is from the Egyptian Ministry of PPPs. They have a very active program. But there they talk about the typical types of projects that they talk about corporatization, which is where the government still controls the state industry, all the way through in various or increasing degrees of independence, right through to almost the privatization process. But across the top, you can see the average contract term they talk about, the services for management, etc., these different values. But what is important, can you see that the more complex the projects get, the longer they become, okay? And that there is a sliding scale of how much the private sector is going to be involved and how much the public sector is going to be involved. You do need to understand that. Much has been written about PPPs, okay? But one often forgets that the public sector forms its own perspectives based on the national domestic market perceptions, okay? So you, I'm sure in this room now, and I don't think anyone would disagree with me, have a certain sense or perception or idea about what PPPs are, okay? It could be right, it could be wrong, it could be half right, it could be half wrong, it could be somewhere, okay? But you have your perceptions, and because of that, you're going to have your certain expectations from the government, okay? What you need to do is develop your perceptions to a sophisticated level so that they align with the government's expectations so that you can have that happy marriage, okay? Now, what it is based, your perceptions or knowledge on PPPs or the market in Sri Lanka is based on something, and it's very simple there, is the availability of information, okay? There is no business that makes decisions in an information vacuum. And I think this is why you're here, because you want to know more. You want to know what information is out there, what is out there that's going to help us. This information can be qualitative and it can be quantitative. But what is becoming more and more important, and this Sri Lanka, the government will find out as it works with the big multilateral banks or the donors or financial institutions, that access to open data, to freely available information is becoming a mandate, and it is becoming a powerful tool which helps people decide about PPPs. Okay, I honestly believe that there's absolutely no reason why any government would withhold any information about a PPP project that's going to be launched. Why would you do that? It serves no purpose, okay? The other problem is that if there is a perception that information is being withheld, that might not be the case. Sometimes there might just not be enough information to release, okay? And this could result in, obviously, this is because maybe feasibility studies haven't been done or enough due diligence hasn't been done. These are some of the factors that really need to be covered. Now, the World Bank and other institutions are adopting what they call the Open Data Contracting Standard, okay? And what this is they have created, now if you can see there, and you'll have the link, is the World Bank's site, where they show how information can be gathered about projects, how the contracts are designed, how the contracts are awarded, and also the progression of the contracts. And why is this important? Because it will help you, by having a look at these different contracts, to get an understanding of what the practice is like in the country, okay? Is it mature? Is the information, is it being managed well? Okay, because these are the questions that you want to ask as the private sector. Now I'm going to pause for a second or two because I think I've thrown a lot of information before I go into the next session. But are there any questions, and I'm not talking about policy as such, or even past projects in Sri Lanka, because there have been a lot of PPP projects, but there are any questions that anyone has on the floor about concerns, confusion, misunderstandings about what PPPs are?
You can ask any question from Mr. David. Also, Mr. Thilan is here from the PPP agency. You can raise questions.
No questions. Should I ask some of you questions? Okay. Let me ask a question then, just a general one. How comfortable are you as companies at this time about launching into a PPP? You know, are you comfortable, or is this something that's new to you? Some heads are nodding. Some are, I think, thinking deeply, okay? I think this is just a good indication for you to understand, okay, that one has to think carefully, okay, about where we are, again, are we ready, and what are we going to do, okay? I looked at the different type of companies that are attending here. There's IT companies, there seem to be some infrastructure companies that are here. You need to think very, very carefully about what type of projects are we going to pursue. You heard a discussion or a mention that there's a need to get an updated and organized pipeline of projects in Sri Lanka. This is going to be sort of the target that you are going to be following. I wrote, and you can see here, this is not self-promotion, this is just to point out something to you, that I wrote a blog recently, and it was titled 10 Important Questions to Ask the Public Sector When Pursuing a PPP Procurement. And the World Bank put it on their website, and it was well received because it was one of the first times that questions were set up that the private sector should be asking the public sector, instead of everything always coming from the public sector towards the private sector. If you get a chance, you can have a look at the full article. I've just pulled out pieces, but it is interesting. What I stated there, it's always the goal of the public procurement officers to prepare appealing tender documents. Okay. So the public sector, to get your interest, is going to have to develop and deliver appealing tender documents that are going to give you enough information. It'll make you easy to decide whether you are going to pursue that PPP or not. Okay. Now this is where I'm going to, if people don't answer, I'm going to go around the room and ask people. So just for the benefit of the room here, if you were going to look at a PPP procurement, what are the types of information that you would like to see in that procurement? Okay, so it's not just we want you, the government is saying, to partner with us and form a PPP agreement and deliver something. What are you looking for from the government that is going to help? Questions, or I will just go right around the room. Okay. So as a private sector company, you see that procurement, okay? What is the first thing, that procurement notice, what is the first thing you're going to look for?
The shares offered to the private sector.
Okay, just say it again for the...
The shares.
The shares, okay.
Yes.
So that's one of the things is, you know, what is the, let's say, the percentage of commitment or partnership that it entails, okay? So what I'm going to do is, because no one's going to get away from this, just pass the mic to the person next to you and let's see what you're looking for.
The risk sharing basis with the who shares which risks, and I mean with what kind of risks private sector
the risk.
Has, yes.
Okay, so we got shares, we've got risk, okay. You want to know what the risk is because you're going to be putting your money into the agreement. Okay, hand over to the next. What are you going to be looking for?
The profit with the investment.
Okay, so she's brought up a good point, the profit. Okay, When people talk about PPPs, people get very upset because they say, why should the private sector make any profit on something? And the answer is very simple. Okay, it's acceptable to make profit because you need your companies to survive. The only challenge is sometimes the expectation of the profit level, whether it's excessive or not. Okay, but profit is important.
The type of the PPP transaction and also the agreement structures that they have,
Okay.
a set of project agreements.
So that's really important because you're going to read that document very carefully to see exactly what the structure is, what the financial agreement is, all the expectation, or are they going to give you, which is important, the opportunity to come up with your own transaction structure, because sometimes when you put your team together, there's going to be different ideas. So do you have that flexibility, which is important?
The governance arrangements, the roles and responsibilities of the sort of the stakeholders involved.
Okay, that's really critically important as well. There's one thing I'd want to mention that needs to be also very clear in procurements, okay? That the word partner and the word stakeholder need to be very, very clearly defined in a public-private partnership. And what am I saying there? Because people generally use the word welcome on board as a partner or welcome on board as a stakeholder. The partner is the companies or the private sector that has signed the contractual agreement. That is the partner in a PPP. The stakeholders are all the other interested parties around. Okay, so other ministries that might be involved, the communities that are involved. So it's really important that when a procurement comes out, that you check that when they say partners, do they mean partners or do they mean stakeholders? And when they say stakeholders, do they mean stakeholders or do they mean partners? I recently sat on a committee in the United States with the US Army Corps of Engineers, and they build major infrastructure projects. And one of the things that they talked about is they had their first meeting and they invited all their partners. But what they really meant were the stakeholders. That were the NGOs, the different ministries involved. And it created a series of expectations that were very confusing.
David, yes, I would like to encourage, we have Mr. Talan here today in these questions. If you have any questions, we're not going to get this opportunity very much. He's a very busy man. And if you do have any questions that you could direct towards him that would also benefit, so you can ask two, one from David, answer, and one from Mr. Talan. One of the things that I've been here now 2 years, been working with PPP, and one of the main things that always comes up eventually is where do I get information? Okay? The National Agency for PPP is a focal point as an investor. I've had people in our workshops. So that just kicks it off. If you have need of information, you can contact the national agency as a resource, okay? And I believe that with what you've heard in the descriptions of the kind of services that will be available, this will also support your due diligence that you have to make up to invest these millions in that proposal. That's a very important point. Millions in that proposal is quite a big decision for a company to make. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to, if you can just pass the mic maybe to 2 or 3 people, and I'll give Talan first an opportunity to say something, and then we'll ask a few more questions, and then I'll get into the 10 questions.
I'd like to be a bit blunt, but the reality is that the PPP unit, as it was initially constructed 4 or 5 months back, has been wound up. So effectively, the initial experiment carried out by the government under the PPP unit has been a failure. And that is the reason the new finance minister, and I'm being very blunt because I don't want to waste your time and mine and everyone else's, the new National Agency for Public-Private Partnership was mooted because the donors, the private sector, government demands that a sustainable structure in this country to carry out PPPs needs to be created. And that's why I was invited to look at creating this new institution. And as you're aware, it was in the newspapers that the cabinet decided to wind up what was then called the PPP unit. All staff contracts were terminated. I mean, I'm not saying this new, it was in the newspapers. And a new agency for public-private partnership is being set up. And I'm actually starting from ground up, similar to what I did in 1996 when the Bureau of Infrastructure Investment was set up. So at the moment, if you want information on PPPs, I think you best look at and talk to the line ministries who have got a few RFQs and RFPs out there. Because we are not yet geared to be a center for information to the level and standards that I believe USAID aspires to, or I aspire to, or the government aspires to. Yes, there's a website up and running, but it's got to be re-looked at. So I'm just being very honest with you that I'm quite optimistic, having painted a few minutes of a negative picture, that we can put our house in order. As I mentioned earlier, we have a very supportive Ministry of Finance, and that is, in my view, the right ministry within which a PPP unit must function. And this has not yet been understood by all. Why is it that the Ministry of Finance is so crucial? And that is because every single PPP contract has contingent or direct liabilities on the country's balance sheet. A more direct impact on the would be something like a power purchase contract or a procurement for water. So therefore, you mentioned earlier the allocation of risk between the public sector and the private sector. I mean, the major portion of the risk has to be borne by the private sector. By definition, that's what a PPP is. But in a situation where there are certain aspects that, such as provision of infrastructure to the periphery of the site for a PPP, that was what was in the Port City PPP structure. Similarly, in the late 90s, when we did hospitals and housing on a PPP structure where the government gave the land on a particular structure and the government also gave infrastructure to the periphery of the site. The private sector carried the entire investment risk and the marketing risk. So there are public sector elements and risk-sharing elements, and the most important aspect in a PPP, and that's why we need the sort of brain trust within the PPP agency to fully understand these aspects and why it is housed in the finance ministry. There is also an instrument called the implementation agreement or a direct lenders agreement in a typical PPP. And an implementation agreement places, or a lender's agreement places certain penalties. Sometimes a concession agreement places penalties on the government if certain conditions precedent are not satisfied. And these need to be carefully weighed by the Ministry of Finance and a cabinet of ministers. So it's well and good that line ministries can issue RFQs and solicit investment, but ultimately there has to be a common set of skills created within a single agency which can address these issues and become also a center to facilitate and convene. I believe the correct word is that the PPP agency, National Agency for PPPs, must necessarily be the convener and the facilitator of the line ministries in conducting PPPs. Well, it is up and running. There are some staff who have remained within, who are being transitioned into the NAPPP. I'm expecting the board appointments to be sorted out this week, and I'm hoping that we will be in a position to, at the moment, let me put it this way, I'm plugging myself in because of the lack of senior staff into the various project committees and the TECs of the ongoing PPPs. Elevated highway from New Kalini Bridge to Aturugiriya, inland water transport, few power projects. There is a little bit of confusion on the port terminal project. So I need to first understand what's gone on historically in the somewhat chaotic procurement process that has prevailed in the past to provide the required guidance. However, I'm happy to say that the World Bank has confirmed that I can draw down on technical funding almost immediately as an advance to the $25 million that has been allocated for technical assistance and viability gap funding by the World Bank. So I have already made requests for specialists, including the looking at the road projects. I can't even recall, there were 2 or 3 specialists that I have requested for. So that's as far as ongoing projects are concerned. I would reckon that, Varuna, correct me if I'm wrong, I can't think of any major PPP project that is where it is imminent that we will financially close. They are pretty much at the first, second level. I mean, so it's at that stage. So as far as creating the groundwork for the new PPPs for which the pipeline is being delivered, I would reckon it's going to take a good part of the next 3 months to lay the groundwork. But that's okay, because if the groundwork is laid, and the entire plan that I have discussed with the finance minister is that I would like to go to the cabinet with a new set of guidelines in about a month. And those guidelines will be fine-tuned, tweaked over a period of time, and then within a period of a year to look at creating a institutional legal structure that would create the institutional capability well beyond my tenure as chairman, so that, you know, in the future, the National Agency for PPPs would recruit the right people, have the right types of boards, and operate with minimal, if any, political interference, where people who are not competent to do these complex transactions are parachuted, like what happened soon after I resigned from the Board of Investment, where literally overnight the BII became defunct. Again, because there was, you know, it was just functioning as a department within the Board of Investment. So it was operating under the board of directors of the BOI. And now have learned from that experience that that's not a sustainable structure, and that is something that the donors and the private sector are insisting as well. It should not merely function as a department within the finance ministry into the future. It needs to have teeth. That was part of the original cabinet paper that was approved by the cabinet. It needs to have institutional credibility, but I do not want to get distracted with the legal aspects at the moment of setting up yet another government institutions. I'm told we have 1,000 government institutions in the country, but I would like to think that this would operate on a different business model than a typical authority or a government agency, which by definition it needs to, if you are to succeed in PPPs well into the future. And one more point that the market research carried out by the World Bank has clearly clearly concluded was that the private sector is demanding a single facilitation point. You know, it is not that the PPP agency is driving the transaction. Line ministry has to come into play, no question. They have the technical knowledge, there's statutory aspects involved. But certainly there needs to be a hand-holding mechanism and a central facilitation and a convening point, and that's what I'm hoping that the guidelines would put in. The guidelines that are being drafted, USAID is helping in that effort along with Nathan Associates. The very fact that the new finance minister initiated a cabinet paper recognizing that things have not gone well, you must give credit to the government that a swift decision was made that, okay, fine, that particular model was not working, and let us really look at creating a more streamlined agency with the right sort of people being brought in. And I believe the Minister of Finance did his market research, spoke to the donor agencies who are very keen, extremely keen to provide grant funding, viability gap funding, technical assistance funding on very concessional terms to the government. But in order to absorb that, there is a requirement of having the right team, it's a people-related business. The issue about going to multiple institutions, I think once we have the PPP guidelines in place, I'm hoping that many of these issues will get resolved, because at the moment also there are conflicts within the same government, within one government agency to another. When I say conflicts, it's conflicting RFPs have also been issued, and RFPs lack information. Feasibility studies or even pre-feasibility studies, basic research has not gone into some of the RFQs that have been issued, and I've had investors complain to me about some of these contradictions also in some of these RFQs. So these are aspects that need to be addressed. Obviously, some of these ministries have retained transaction advisors, but I know some of these ministries downloaded them from the internet. So this is serious business, PPPs, because the country's credibility is at stake. As David mentioned, it costs millions of dollars. Well, it costs initially thousands of dollars to first come and pick up one of these RFQs and pay whatever the deposit that you have to pay. In terms of consistency, I think very clearly the 3-year policy statement of the government is due out, I think, first week of next month. And I'm involved in some of the deliberations, and there's great emphasis being laid. Yes, I know there was a disconnect between the Prime Minister's vision and some of the budgets that of days gone past, but there is certainly coherence between very cohesive strategy and consistent policies that you will see in the private sector over the next 3 to 5 years. Yes, there's a lot of debate about the new Inland Revenue Bill, but again, I believe there are features in that would ensure consistency.
The pre-feasibility and the feasibility, some of those EOIs and the RFQs that have been issued, ministries have not done their homework. So what has happened basically, back to square one. So basically the ministries expect the private sector to do the feasibility and the pre-feasibility, whatever the information. So there's a gap. So I guess your agency need to step into that one urgently. The second thing is that your agency should work not as a facilitator, but it should have some oversight function also, or some sort of enforcing function. So then recently, there was a decision. I don't want to mention the project where from the very high level, there was a directive to do what you call feasibility study. But when it comes to the ministries, they say, no, we don't have to do the feasibility study. So without the feasibility, there is no sort of, it does not start the projects. So therefore, I think you need to have that kind of teeth. That's what I believe.
I think that's what the cabinet paper of 11th July also mentioned, Sarath, that the new agency must have a certain amount of teeth, but that will come eventually. But at the moment, the oversight is being given by the finance ministry, because even though the other certain line agencies might want to go through with the process, what I can call a half-baked process in issuing RFQs, really there'll come a point where the finance ministry oversight will be brought to bear when it comes to the concession agreement, the implementation agreements, the direct lenders agreements, the lease agreements, etc. So the message that I think the finance minister is very shortly carrying to the cabinet also in terms of a preliminary set of policies, and I'm expecting this to go to cabinet next week, is to give the message to the line ministries and the ministers, please call the NAPPP, because they have funding to fund the pre-feasibilities and the feasibility studies. Amali has just left, but Amali has very clearly told me till such time the World Bank's internal procurement procedure is over, I can draw an advance, or the line ministry can make a request through us to draw advance funds to complete that research and basic feasibilities that are required to be done. So I believe there is a lot more interaction that the NAPPP needs to have with the line ministries. These last 3 weeks, I've been primarily gathering information in terms of what's happening, but I am hoping to call on the relevant secretaries to send this message. And once I'm involved with some of the project committees, certainly I'll be explaining what the possibilities are.
So if there's no more questions, can we go back to presentation? I think that there's 10 questions here as private sector are really pretty good to think about. David?
Okay, so it's really great to hear, well, not great to hear, but good to hear where things are at the moment, because there's going to be, I think, there's been sort of a realization by the government that things have to be improved, that have to be restructured. It's important because mistakes have been made and things haven't been operating, and a new model needs to be identified. Now, the question that I always ask is that, it's really important for the public sector. If they want to attract qualified responses, there's got to be enough information that's available. Okay, so we had a discussion, a few of the things that you were looking for that you'd want to be aware of. But the people can only submit qualified responses if there's enough information, if they understand what's happening. And so the questions that you have to ask yourself, are we there? Are we ready to start launching? Are we willing? This is one of the things that's really important, is are we willing to spend those thousands to get the documents? Are we willing to spend millions to prepare a proposal? And the other is, do we really understand what the government wants when they talk about a certain project? So these questions that I'm going to give you, I would say, I'm not saying they're the best questions, but these are the questions that I think over the 1 to 5 years that has been discussed as the framework of things as they're moving forward, that you start asking the public sector, because you visit with them. You'd be crazy if you weren't visiting with the public sector, if you weren't having discussions with them, trying to find out where they're going, what their plans are. But I think these 10 questions are something that you should keep somewhere in your back pocket, on your strategy list, whatever, and ask these questions of the public sector so that you can understand what they want. And let's look at the first question. So the first question is the project included in a pipeline of nationally sanctioned strategic infrastructure projects? And this could also be social service projects, okay? Why is that important? Because you've heard now that with this new PPP, the national PPP unit that's going to be established, they want to sort of coordinate the efforts and what's happening. Okay, so you need to ask that question. If you hear this you need to ask the public sector that's issuing this, is this project part of the national program? Okay, or is it just something that the ministry has got an idea for? And I think that's what's happened in the past, that the ministries have all issued, as you heard, contradictory RFPs and all of that. And so, you could have 2 ministries trying to launch the same project, parallel with one another. So the question is, ask this, is the project sanctioned? Is it part of the national pipeline? Okay, because that will really give you a sense of whether the different organizations do support it. Does the financial ministry, does the treasury support it? Because if they don't, there could be a world of hurt and a world of disappointment there. Does that question make sense? Okay, so there's a lot of talk about a lot of projects being lined up. Hopefully the government will include them in a sanctioned list of strategically important PPP projects so that you can understand that we're not going to put all that effort into a project and then it suddenly disappears and it doesn't happen. Okay, so ask that question. The second question is there a broad and bipartisan political support for the project? Do you understand what I mean by bipartisanship? That means, do all the politicians generally support the project? Okay. Why is that important? Okay. How long is a politician elected for in Sri Lanka typically? 5 years? Okay. How long is a PPP project? 25 to 30 years. How many different politicians could be involved with that project? 5 to 6. Okay, depending how long the project is. Okay. So if there isn't broad-based political support for the project, there's going to be a perception of risk that, we could get involved in a project. In 5 years' time, there's a change of government because Sri Lanka is a democracy and there are elections. And are the politicians still going to support the project? Okay. Now, you might think, oh, this is fine for somebody like Mr. Baxter coming from the United States and saying this. This is a situation that's very relevant in the United States as well. Okay. We have changes of government, we have changes of administrations, and at this stage, if you've been following the news in the United States, President Trump was going to initiate the large national infrastructure plan. Okay, everyone got terribly excited, everyone got committed, people were lining up with thousands of different options and ideas of PP projects that they want to launch. Okay, guess what's happened to the national infrastructure plan? It's got nowhere. Okay, and people are getting disheartened and people are getting upset. But it's crazy because if there is one policy that the government, let's say the politicians in the United States actually believe in, there's the need to improve the national infrastructure. Okay, so you need to ask that question. So where do you find out? Listen to what the politicians say. Listen to what the political agendas of the different political parties are. Okay, talk to them. Find out, is the government launching projects that are acceptable across all parties because it's something that everyone needs? Or is it a policy, is it a project they're launching because it's going to win them favor with a certain constituency? Okay. Those are, you know, this is one of the questions, and it's a tough question, okay. But one of the other things that you also need to do, and hopefully the new national PPP unit will look at, is that they will have champions, political champions from all parties that will support the agendas. I'm not going to get into the politics of Sri Lanka. I have been reading the newspaper for the last year on what's happening here. But there is a lot of political play on PPPs here. And one needs to understand where it's going and what it's about. This is what I'm saying. You need to understand that as a company. So if somebody is proposing another airport, for example, okay, do we need it? Are the politicians going to support it? Can the country afford it? Those are the type of questions that you should think about. Okay. The next question, and this is a difficult one. Has that specific ministry or that specific agency ever procured a PPP project before? Okay. An important question. Okay. Why is that important? Because if they have a history of projects, of PPP projects, they're going to have learned lessons, they're going to apply it, and they are going to be issuing better tenders, they're going to be issuing better, better projects, and they have the ability to succeed. But if it's a first-time effort by an agency or ministry, there's going to be risk. Okay, so what questions could you ask about that? Who's going to help you prepare the project? Are you going to be working with different consulting companies? And I noticed there were KPMGs here and Pricewaterhouses here. Okay, so those are companies that get into the involvement of helping government agencies build this capacity. So you have to ask yourself and understand, there's a certain risk involved in whether they have done it or not. Now this was a very interesting question because what Tulum had said, which I thought was really pertinent, is he said that with all the firings and the reorganizations and everything that had taken place, there were a tremendous amount of procurement officers and staff that were involved in PPPs, if I understood correctly what he said, that didn't understand what PPPs really were. Okay, and this is why they had to be let go. Okay, so when an institution issues a PPP procurement proposal, you need to understand what PPPs are so that you can determine whether the public sector knows what a PPP is. Okay. So if they start throwing in little words of like privatization in it and things like that, I would start getting worried. Okay. So, it's a situation that in many emerging markets, there is limited understanding of what PPPs are. That will determine the expectations that are going to be set, and you need to be able to understand that the expectations that the inexperienced, maybe naive proponents of the projects have, are they even reasonable? Now, there is a haste often with companies in the private sector that think, well, you know, we will take the risk. We will get involved in the project, you know. It's easy if it's just a design-build type project, because after 2-3 years, you've designed and built it and you walk away. But when you're going to be tied to it for another 20 or another 30 years, this is really, really important to understand, that you understand the expectations and where they're going. Okay. Let me ask you a question. Do you think that the public sector at this stage really understands what PPPs are about? Okay, I'm seeing most people going, you know, shaking their heads. Okay. Is that a concern for you? Yes, it is. Okay. Why is it a concern? Anyone want to give an answer to that? Changes of policies, yeah. Policies get changed if they weren't well set up. Okay, so that's one of the things that needs to be be considered. Okay, so this is a question. Ask that question. Hey, you're issuing an RFP for a PPP. Do you understand what it is about yourself? Because if you don't understand it, we're never going to understand it. Okay. The next question is, why was it decided to do a PPP? Now, here's a fact that you need to understand about PPPs. Sometimes it's not best to do a project as a PPP. Okay. Sometimes it would just be better to let the government take care of it themselves and do it as a traditional procurement. So what you need there is a very clear rationale for the decisions. These are things that you really have to look out for in the documents if you haven't heard of them before. The feasibility study. $1 million project, how thick do you think the feasibility study is going to be? 10 pages? I've seen feasibility studies for $1 billion projects that were 10 pages, okay? They are going to be volumes. Okay, 5 or 6 volumes. You could be looking at 2,000 to 3,000 pages for a feasibility study, okay? And the feasibility covers everything from economic feasibility, social feasibility, operational feasibility, you can go down the list, okay? So if the feasibility studies aren't available, that should be a concern and a red flag. Have you heard of the term value for money? Okay. Value for money, and listen very carefully to this, value for money is not always just the monetary value, but it is also the value that the project will bring to society based on the money that's going to be spent. Okay, so societal benefits and things like that. And this is often where the value for money leads to a decision to have a PPP because it might be more expensive, but the benefits are vast and it's worth that effort. So you need to understand that. The other is the public sector comparator. Have you heard of that term? Okay. And this is a study that's typically done, okay, when the government will decide whether they're going to do it as a PPP. Can they do it cheaper or better than the private sector? Sometimes they can do it cheaper, but they can't do it better. Or sometimes they can do it better, but it's going to cost more, but there are these variations. You've got to understand what the public sector comparator is. And then a term that was mentioned here by our panelists was the whole sense of sustainability of the project. Okay, sustainability. There's a new term that's creeping into the decisions on PPPs. I haven't got it here, but this is a term that the World Bank is looking at as well, is the term resilience. Okay, and what they're talking about in resilience is the ability of a project to survive an unexpected event. Okay. You guys, a few years ago, had a major experience with a natural event that caused chaos in this country, and that was the Indian Ocean tsunami. Okay. And I know everyone read about in the press on your east coast, there was tremendous amounts of damage. Infrastructure was damaged. I think one of the iconic examples that was shown around the world was about your coastal railway line, which got destroyed by the tsunami. Okay. The World Bank and all these different organizations are now saying that we are not going to finance projects that are not resilient. Okay, so this is something you need to look at. So I'll say is what was the information that the government gathered, and you can ask this because this information should be put in the procurement packages. What information was was gathered that helped them decide why they were going to launch the project as a PPP? Okay, because if the government is not sure that it should have been launched as a PPP, can you just imagine the risk that could be there? Okay. There is the big chance of risk. Any questions? Let's go on to the next one. Is the project bankable? Have you heard of the term bankability? Okay. And it's very simple. When they're talking about bankability, they're talking about whether the investors, financial institutions, are willing to invest money in that project. Okay, that's the sense of bankability. And basically the situation is that certain things that are based on bankability is whether there's a clear revenue stream, you know, is there a description, so if it's a toll road, are there going to be enough cars using it to generate revenue? Okay, those studies are very, very difficult to perform, and it depends on which consultants you bring on board who do those studies. Okay, so you need to be very cautious about some of the studies, but the clear revenue streams. You know, some projects will never generate enough money on their own. Okay, one type of project that's launched as a PPP around the world many, many times, but is not viable unless it has subsidies, is sort of urban rail transport. Okay. You can't charge enough tariffs or ticket fees or whatever you want to call it for a typical rail project that carries passengers for it to pay for itself. Okay. It's the long transportation routes that transport heavy freight and that, for example, which generate enough revenues to pay for themselves. The city that I live in Washington, D.C., is struggling with that. I don't know if any of you have been to Washington, D.C., but they have quite an elaborate metro system. It is in a financial disaster because the subsidies that were required aren't enough. So if you're looking at the bankability, if there's, or social programs, healthcare programs and that, okay, a lot of people might not be able to afford hospital fees for a hospital PPP. Is the government going to provide subsidies? Those are the sort of things that are important. Availability payments, do you know what availability payments are? You know, is important. Are they going to pay if it underperforms? You know, there's a certain amount of payment that the government guarantees if you provide the service. Okay, so these are some of the, you know, the questions that you really need to be looking for with your team. There will be different members of your team that will look at the different questions. This bankability project obviously is sort of the type of team that you would need would be accountants and financial experts. Okay, now this is a question that we've heard now that it's a difficult situation in Sri Lanka. Does the institutional capacity exist to manage a PPP project? Okay, how do you feel? Poor. Okay, I think it's been admitted here, okay, that a lot has to be done to build up the institutions to ensure that they can manage PPPs. Okay. Institutional capacity building, if you look at the World Bank and many of the different international institutions, is a major focus of governments, okay, to build up that institutional capacity. And luckily for Sri Lanka, the World Bank and other institutions and USAID are helping to build up the institutional capacity of institutions, okay? But you need to ask yourself, are there people in the public sector who are knowledgeable and competent co-managers of the contract? Because they're going to manage you if you enter into a PPP project. But the other question you need to ask yourself, are we capable as an institution to launch into a PPP? Not just the government, okay? Because the government is going to help you to a certain degree, but once you've signed that contract and you're off and you're on the go, they're expecting you to manage it. And let me reiterate again, 20 to 30 years of commitment. Many institutions fall flat, private sector institutions fall flat, because they have a team that has helped to capture the project and to launch the project and that, and then what happens? People get lured away to other companies, you don't keep up your team, you don't train your team, and so you start over time losing your own institutional capacity to manage that project. And that's important. I was speaking to the head of a very, very large US company recently. This is a company that has sales, infrastructure business sales of about $5 to $6 billion a year. And I asked him, as a private sector institution, what is the biggest fear that you have about winning a PPP project? Because everyone wants to win that $1 billion project, because if you were the team leader that won the $1 billion project, you're a hero in the company. And he said, the biggest concern that I have is if we win the project, will it just destroy all our other programs? And I said, why, what do you mean by that? He said, because we will have to commit so many resources to that project that we might not be able to look at another project for 10 years. Okay, so we're going to be tied to one project. Just think of what it takes to run a $1 billion project, or even a $500 million project. Okay, you need to understand that it's not just asking the government, do they have the capacity to do it, but do you have the capacity to do it as well? Okay, now this is a question that seems really strange, but it's very relevant. Is the project size reasonable enough to be for a PPP? Okay. Let me ask you, if you're an ambitious company and there's a PPP series of procurements come out, okay, and there's 5 or 6 $10 million PPPs, then there is 2 or 3 $100 million PPP projects, and then there's one $500 million PPP project. If you're an ambitious company and you're big enough, which one are you going to pursue? The 500 million. Okay. Why? The promises of returns, the effort that goes into procuring, or sorry, not procuring, but proposing on a $500 million project could be the same as a $100 million project. Okay. You're still going to have to hire the same transaction advisors. You're still going to have the same lawyers and all of that. But it's just the magnitude of money that is involved. So anyone have a clue what your transactional fees could be on large projects? 500 million, it's not uncommon to have $10 million in transaction fees. Okay. Would you rather spend 10 million on 500 million, or would you rather spend 10 million on 100 million? I mean, it's obvious, okay. But people forget that, okay. So what you need to do is, if the government starts issuing lots of little projects, it's worth it to approach them and say, you know, we're not going to pursue these unless you, for example, bundle them. You know what I mean by the term bundling? You combine them. The state of Pennsylvania in the United States had about 1,000 bridges that needed upgrading. These weren't big bridges, but you know, little local bridges over streams, over rivers, gullies, and things like that. They tried launching them individually, each of them as PPPs. No one even responded. Then what they did was they bundled them into bundles of about 100 bridges at a time, and there was interest. Okay. So you need to have those conversations with the government and give them a sense of what type of projects you are interested in. And I would think that the government also should really be considered that if it's, or think about it, that if they're going to launch PPP projects, the small ones they should just manage, because they can afford that. They should focus on the large projects. Now this is one that gets most people terribly excited about and concerned. Is the procurement process truly transparent? And is it competitive? Is this something that you're concerned about? Okay. Well, what are we saying here is Transparency means that everyone should have the same opportunity to the access to information and an understanding of how the procurement was set up, how it was awarded, and who was awarded it. Okay. Competitive means that there shouldn't be constraints put on projects of who can bid on it. Now, this is often in countries which are very nationalistic or have national pride a big challenge, because sometimes they will reserve certain projects for only domestic companies. Okay. If the World Bank's going to fund it, they're not going to allow that to happen because they want international procurement as well. And that creates challenges for domestic companies because you could find yourself competing against other companies as well, okay, from outside. So competitiveness is important, transparency is important, but what you also can do is, and I would say this is a good bit of advice, if it's going to be truly competitive, you might have to look for forming partnerships with international companies. And there's a benefit from that, because this might be your first time that you are going to be doing a PPP. But if you do it in a partnership with another company that has done 10, 15, 20 in other parts of the world, you're going to have the benefit of learning what they've done and the best practice, and learning their best practices. Okay, this is the one thing that I did want to point out, which was important. Do you have a clear understanding of the different roles of partners and stakeholders? Okay. And this is very, very simple. Okay. When you're a partner, you're contractually obliged. Okay. And that puts certain pressures on you. Okay. But you do need to understand that when you're a partner, you are still going to be answerable to certain stakeholders. Okay. And who are these stakeholders? So if you bid, for example, on a highway project, okay, there are going to be different ministries that are going to have interest. The Ministry of Environment, for example, might have interest depending where the road's going to be built. Okay. If you're building I can give you a classic example. In Saudi Arabia, I was working with the Ministry of Economy and Planning, as I mentioned. They built, under a PPP, the new Saudi, they call it the financial city. This is like a district within the city of Riyadh that they built. And they required all the different banks, etc., to put their headquarters there. And so all the banks and everyone went ahead and built these large buildings to house their banks there and that. And then they realized there was a problem. The stakeholders hadn't really been consulted. And what did I mean by that? They hadn't talked to the Ministry of Power. So there was no plan for the Ministry of Power to even to bring electricity to that project. Okay. They hadn't talked to the Ministry of Public Works and Water. So there was no plan to bring water to the project. I don't know about you, but there's not many institutions or buildings that can survive or even operate without electricity and without water. The project collapsed. Okay. People lost billions. Okay. All because they didn't have that conversation with stakeholders. Okay. So think carefully, you know, when the government says who their partners are, if you're going to enter into that, you are the partner. It's not all the people around. But the stakeholders are the people that I would say can make or break your project. Okay. And, you know, I don't want to get into the specifics of it, but I'm not a great expert. But I read recently the port that you've built here, what's it, Hambantota, the new port, okay, which hasn't been that successful. It was kind of it was launched as a PPP. Now there's discussion of having a new economic zone situated around the port to expand the way to bring in, you know, extra money. But that the surrounding communities are not terribly excited about it because there's going to be land losses, etc. And I'm just reporting what I've read in the press, okay? So there's a situation of partners involved with PPP, but stakeholders on the outside who might not be terribly excited about the process. Okay. So questions. Do you find this list useful? Okay. Are you going to apply it? Okay. Are you going to think about it? Okay. It's very, very simple questions, but I'm going to say that these are simple questions that can save you a fortune. Okay. And you need to have the conversation with the government about these questions. Okay. So as the PPP unit is built, or reconstructed, or however the term that's happening here, you need to see that you have a voice as well, because you are also going to be a stakeholder in the national PPP program. Okay. And I would say don't sit around and wait for things to come to you, but if you're really interested in pursuing a PPP program as a private sector company, that you need to consider this. Just to reiterate some of the things, that every procurement needs to take place in an information-rich environment. Okay, you need information. Okay, if you don't have that information, how can you decide whether you want to even enter into the PPP market? Okay, you also need to provide the information that gives a degree of comfort. Okay, I personally believe, and this is my opinion, that there is no information related to a PPP procurement that the government should ever keep secret or keep to themselves. Okay? Because it should be public information, it should be public knowledge. Okay? There is no purpose served by non-disclosure. Okay? In certain countries, they even, once the contract is awarded, the contract is placed on a website so that everyone can see how it was awarded, why it was awarded, and what the terms were. The only type of information that is generally kept and is protected is things like intellectual property. There might be specific intellectual property, and also things like company information. So they wouldn't put in things like labor rates, what you're paying your staff, you know, all those sort of things. That's information that's got to do with no one else. Okay? So those are 10 questions that I hope you will consider, take to heart, think about. Okay? Don't take shortcuts. Okay? A shortcut doesn't help you. Think carefully whether you want to be part of a PPP. If you are a small local company, and small, you know, in your sense might not be small by Sri Lankan terms, but by international terms you might be small. Find those partners internationally that are interested in the market as well, and find ways to bring them on board as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much. I do believe that the session, well, I'd like to thank Mr. Talan, David, others that were here today, the Chamber. We will be having more of these over the next many, many months, and we will keep you informed as much as we can. The open data standard, the open contracting standard, and the PPP extension. Mr. Algama spoke of a EGP, electronic government system. The information that is there or will be there eventually, hypothetically, is a kind of information that you would use in making your analysis to do your investments, okay? There is an open government partnership, which Sri Lanka, you can look this up on the internet. It talks about open government standards. Your Ministry of Statistics or Bureau of National Statistics are now listing a lot of different types of information in the format that I'm talking about. Okay, I build these systems. So we're applying that to all types of procurement, and the World Bank is supporting that. If you'll go to your one page before you leave, it talks about the disclosure that's required in PPP, the framework for disclosure in PPP projects. This is an international standard now because the World Bank and other major donors. We hope that that will eventually give you even more information, all right? So thank you very much.